Okay, I think we'll get started now. So welcome everybody and thanks for joining us. I'm Sarah Van Exen and I'm GreenPAC's Executive Director. You can listen to this event in both official languages by clicking the translation button at the bottom of your Zoom window. There's also an option if you click subtitles to see the closed captioning along the bottom of your screen. As we get started, I'd like to thank and acknowledge those whose land we are on. Much of the work that we'll be talking about today takes place on the unceded, unsurrendered lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, but I'm joining you from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. Let me also acknowledge that uplifting and respecting the leadership, stewardship, and sovereignty of Indigenous people is critical to addressing the biodiversity and climate crises. Some of you may be familiar with GreenPAC, but for those who aren't, we're a national nonprofit organization and we're focused on inspiring, activating, and amplifying environmental leadership in politics. I hope that you'll check us out and follow our work at greenpac.ca. We run several programs and we convene conversations like this one to engage more people in building environmental leadership in politics. I'd like to thank our seasoned sponsors for their support. And I would also like to thank the family foundations that enable our programming. This is particularly relevant because today's conversation has a unique connection to our Parliamentary Internship for the Environment program, which is the only environment-focused youth internship program in Canada, political youth internship program. And lastly, thank you to our community partners for their support with making this event happen. And now I'd just like to invite our panelists to join me on screen. And as they do, I'll quickly say that we'll take several questions from the audience during our conversation today. You were all invited to share questions as you registered, but you'll also be able to submit questions using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And we'll share that full list with senators after the event if we don't get to them all today. So now it's my pleasure to just very briefly introduce Senator Mary Coyle. Senator Coyle has represented Nova Scotia in the Senate since 2017. She has an extensive background in post-secondary education and in the nonprofit sector and has facilitated local development projects around the globe. I'd also like to welcome Senator Rosa Galvez, who represents Quebec and has since 2016. Senator Galvez is an environmental engineer, the former chair of Laval University Civil and Water Engineering Department, and is president of the Par-America Parliamentary Network on Climate Change. Welcome also to Senator Stan Kutcher, who's represented Nova Scotia since 2018, is an accomplished psychiatrist and specializes in adolescent mental health and has received numerous accolades for his work to advance mental health, literacy, and care. Welcome to the Honourable Grant Mitchell, whose career in Canadian politics has spanned decades as an MLA, leader of the Alberta Liberal Party and official opposition, and as a senator from 2005 to 2020, including as government liaison. So Mr. Mitchell is really well equipped to speak to us today about the Senate's evolution. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Coco Wang, GreenPAC's intern to the Senate under Senator Coyle. One of Coco's responsibilities before she heads off to the new Lincoln Alexander School of Law this fall is to coordinate the Senators for Climate Solutions Group. Thanks, Senators. Thanks, Mr. Mitchell, and thanks, Coco.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Sarah. It's an honor to be moderating this very important conversation. So let's dig in by beginning with Senator Coyle and Senator Kutcher. Let's chat about the Senators for Climate Solutions Group, a very new group that you two have founded together. So Senator Coyle, as one of the co-founders of this group, can you just tell us about what sparked its creation?
I'm happy to do that, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. I want to thank GreenPAC, and I particularly want to thank Coco and all of the GreenPAC interns who are superstars and who are helping myself and other parliamentarians across Parliament Hill. So I want to just start there. So I've been an independent senator for a little more than 4 years now. I'm not a climate expert in any way. I am a member of the all-party climate caucus here, which is parliamentarians from the House of Commons and senators. But I'm not a climate expert. Senator Galvez is a climate expert. I'm an interested citizen. And climate is something that I think most of us are interested in. For me, I see the imperative and the opportunity of climate action. And when I first came to the Senate, I noticed that there really wasn't a whole lot of conversation about climate or climate issues. There was some controversy, some polarization around two particular bills early in my tenure as a senator. The bill that amended and updated the Impact Assessment Act and the oil tanker moratorium. But other than that, really, there wasn't at that time a lot of talk about climate. There is, I must say, a little bit more now. So I decided to try to spark some conversations in the Senate. It was as simple as that. And with Senator Grant Mitchell, who's with us here today, we started an inquiry, looking at pathways for Canada to meet our net zero obligations. And I'd introduced a second inquiry to try to get other senators engaged in conversations on climate solutions, spoken in response to the speech from the throne, again, on climate a couple of times. Interesting, you just never know in life who's going to pick up on, what you're doing. So as it turns out, that first inquiry was in 2020. And Baroness Heyman and Worthington, who are the co-chairs and co-founders of something called Peers for the Planet, the UK House of Lords Climate Action and Biodiversity Group, learned about the inquiry that Grant Mitchell and I had worked on. And they contacted me and said, well, here's what we're doing. Are you doing something similar with senators in Canada? And I thought, well, there's so much that we could learn from what our peers at Peers for the Planet are doing, an upper house situation. And so talked with my colleague, Senator Kutcher, and we put out the call to our fellow senators just a little over a year ago now, and the rest is history. Now we're in business. I'm sure we'll get into more of that in a minute.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Senator Coyle. And just briefly, what do you think about the group makes it uniquely positioned to provide leadership, whether it's within the Senate or within Parliament in general?
Okay. So that's what sparked the creation. Now, how can we provide leadership? Well, we're a very particular group. I'm somewhat inspired by fellow Canadian climate scientist, Catherine Hayhoe, who says that a thermometer is not liberal or conservative. Okay, I think that's a really important quote. Parliamentarians we know of all stripes are concerned about climate, right? And our group is a group which welcomes and in fact encourages membership from every group in the Senate of Canada. And in fact, we have 44 members in our group from every group in the Senate, as well as an unaffiliated member. So that's an important thing, and that helps us provide leadership across the aisle, if you like. And that's very similar to what Peers for the Planet do. So we are fortunate in the Senate in that we have longer time horizons than some of our colleagues do in the House of Commons, because we are much less affected by electoral cycles. We are here, if we want to be, until we turn 75 years old. I've still got some runway. And we are also far more independent and less tied to partisan influence in what we do. And that is so critical on issues related to climate, which can be very divisive politically. So that's important. And we as senators have three main functions, which I'm sure people know, but I'll just quickly go through them. We represent our regions, and we in particular represent those whose voices are not often heard. So that representation. We are also very involved in the investigation or study of matters that are of absolute importance to Canada and to Canadians. And thirdly, and of course, very importantly, legislation, that our job is legislation. So those are some of the things that we can provide leadership on. And finally, I would say that with our 44 senators from all groups, we are very well positioned to have an impact on the government's agenda on climate. I just imagine the influence. We're just a little over a year old, so we really just got going in the fall. So we're just starting to build our capacity to have an impact.
Awesome. Thank you, Senator Coyle. And so Senator Kutcher, as the other co-founder of the group, with these contexts provided, what do you hope this group will achieve, perhaps in the next few years or even long term?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Coco. And I want to echo Mary's thanks to you and GreenPAC for putting this on. You know, the reality is that Senator Coyle was the brains and the brawn behind this. My job is to carry her briefcase, so I'm doing the best I can on that, just to keep up with her. She's a real meteor. We actually surveyed our group and asked for their inputs on this question, and what we got back was a real interest and willingness, an intense interest and willingness to be better informed and have a much better understanding about the issues, the existential issues that climate change is bringing to all of us, not just in Canada, but globally. And then to use that understanding information to move towards the solutions. We're not here to wring our hands. We're here actually to solve the problems that we have to deal with. This is an existential crisis, and it won't be solved unless we actually come up with some solutions. And so that's one of our big focuses. We're going to use that knowledge in our legislative work. And we also use that knowledge in all of our other work and our roles as senators, to keep our eyes on that, to keep these issues on the Senate radar, to keep these issues, as Senator Coyle has said, on the government radar. And it doesn't matter who is the government, to try to continue to put their feet to the fire. And our job, as I see it, is to nudge civil society, government, decision makers towards success. And success will be measured by the solutions that we bring to bear on these problems.
Thank you for that. So to touch on, I guess, within the last year or a few months that the group has been together, Senator Coyle, what has the group been doing so far, just on that topic of bringing us solutions?
Unmute. Thank you very much for that question, Coco. I think you know very well what we've been doing, because you've been helping us every step of the way, as have Verena in the past, and also Owen and Camilla, who have helped us early on in this cycle. So we don't do anything without the help, frankly, of our friends at GreenPAC. We've been so fortunate. I just wanted to start off by saying, building on what Stan said, we are absolutely agnostic on solutions. Let me just put that on the table. The group we do not take a group position per se, for instance, on issues like small modular nuclear reactors. We do not take a position on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We study those things together. And different senators within our group will take different approaches and have different positions on those. But we are creating this very big tent with Senators for Climate Solution that is a space where everybody who's concerned about climate and finding solutions has a place at the table. So I just want to, re-emphasize the importance of that. As Stan has said, one of the key things that we've been doing in this early stage, of course, we're creating an organization. So, bringing people in, asking them what they would like us to do. And we'll be going back out again to ask people, how do we do in the first year? So this first year, a lot of the emphasis has been on learning, putting the group together and then learning together in a couple of ways. So we were fortunate in that we had COP26 coming up last fall. just as we were forming the group, it was a great kind of rallying point, way to get people's attention. Also, the new parliament had not started yet, so we had a runway and some people's attention actually that we could engage people on. If speaker events, we had the Fatih Birol, who's the head of the International Energy Agency, speak to our group. We had Canada's chief negotiator at COP speak to us before he went off to talk about what he was hoping was going to be accomplished. We've had our two key ministers, Minister of Environment, Minister of Natural Resources, Guilbeault and Wilkinson. Recently, we had Mark Carney speaking with us about finance. And we've had briefing notes on a whole variety of topics related to COP26, but also related, our most recent briefing note is going out, I think, today on Stockholm Plus 50. What happened at Stockholm Plus 50? How can we provide a brief, tangible summary for our colleagues so that they can grasp what's going on? Ultimately, how parliamentarians make a difference is mostly through legislation. And mostly through government legislation. And so we are developing our capacity to provide a climate lens on legislation so that the solutions that come forward on climate-related issues are the right ones. So that is something that we are working hard on. And the final thing I will mention here is we are also conveners. Senators are conveners of Canadians, conveners of organizations, conveners of individuals. We are starting to investigate the possibility of climate assembly for Canada. Look, we're just early days studying citizens' assemblies and what climate assembly might look like for Canada and what an appropriate role for us would be. Thank you.
Thank you for providing us a very, I think, wholesome outlook of what the group is doing. And just moving on to the role of senators in terms of pushing environmental progress. Could Senator Kutcher or Senator Coyle, could you just tell us a bit about what kind of levers the Senate can pull that are unique to the Senate versus the House of Commons to really drive environmental progress? Maybe Senator Kutcher, you can start.
Sure. I think Senator Coyle has said that there are many tools in the toolbox, and it's using the appropriate ones and then using them all. Senator Coyle has another inquiry in the Senate now. Senator Galvez had a motion that many people spoke to. We have direct contact with our colleagues in the House, with other stakeholders. As Senator Coyle has mentioned, we're looking at public engagement ideas. We can also reach outside Canada to other upper chambers and start those conversations on a global level. And we also have studies, committees that we can try to influence. I sit on fisheries and oceans, and we're now looking at options for studying, and I'm bringing forward an option for studying on climate solutions through oceans. So there are all these different kinds of ways that we can work on this. Awesome, thank you. And Senator Coyle, do you want to comment on that?
I think Senator Kutcher has covered certainly most of the territory, but maybe I'll just expand a little bit, just with some examples. I had mentioned earlier Peers for the Planet in the UK. We've learned a lot from what they're doing. We have another session with them, with our members next week, and it's a great way to imagine, what an upper house can do and what kind of an impact an upper house can have. They've been very influential, particularly on legislation you wouldn't necessarily associate with climate, on pension legislation, on finance. They've had a whole lot of success on influencing legislation in the UK. We're also in contact with our counterparts in Ireland, and we've started conversations with the Senate in Ireland about something they're doing with engaging youth and having youth leaders come from throughout Ireland to the Senate to enter into debate on climate and Ireland's climate future with the senators. And that's something that we're starting to investigate as a possible area for us to engage in.
Thank you so much. And so at this time, I think we can move on to talking about legislative efforts in the Senate. And I'd like to invite Senator Galvez as well. So Senator Galvez, just on the topic of the levers in the Senate to drive environmental progress, you've recently used one of these levers, and in March, you introduced the Climate Aligned Finance Act into the Senate. So could you just tell us a little about your bill and what compelled you to advance it?
Sure. First, let me thank you, like my colleagues, to GreenPAC and to you to organize this. I also want to really thank Mary and Stan to organize the group of Senators for Climate Solution. It's important that everybody's informed what's going on in this area and that what are the points that needs to be debated. It's extremely important. I'm an engineer, so I am so direct related to construction and to delivering. So for me, it's like I have a project, I have to design it, I have to plan it, and I have to deliver. And so I have run a lot of studies, and the COVID provided with a period where you can reflect and you can study and you can think and you can reflect. And so looking at why we are so slow in the process to moving forward to a low carbon economy, it was definitely very evident. It was the elephant in the room that the financial sector is lagging. And compared with legislations and jurisdictions in Europe, in England, in the Commonwealth, and even in Latin America, we saw that there are some jurisdictions that are way ahead of us, and even the Americans are also with imposing new regulations, and we needed to solve this issue. So what happened with the financial sector, the banks, the insurance, and the pension plans, and the venture capitals, is that they are all worried about what climate change is bringing in disruption, and that the risk of climate change is increasing, whether because the technology is changing, whether because the policy is changing, whether because the extreme weather events are being destructive and they are destroying assets and reducing the lifetime of an infrastructure. And on the other hand, the financial sector is still fueling the climate crisis because it's massively investing in fossil fuels. So that's one of the big reasons because we don't attain, Canada haven't attained any of our targets. And so we needed to put some harmony there. Also, the other thing is that because we are focusing on keep developing the fossil fuel sector, we lock into this old technology and all the new developments that are happening around the world in renewable energy, we are not seeing here in Canada. So our competitiveness, our training, our research and innovation, our intellectual property is not moving. It's not moving. Also, we find during this reflection that there was a lot of conflict of interest. There is a lot of familiarity and small groups that control the financial, the fossil fuel, the banks, and so and even the pension plans. And so we heard a lot. We ran consultations. We heard, I think, at least 200 people of different stakeholders, and we listened. And with all that information, we deliver CAFA. Is the nickname that we use for our Climate Aligned Finance Act. And so this bill tries to align the financial sector with the climate commitments. So we have climate commitments, domestic and international. We passed, I was the sponsor in the Senate of net zero 2050. And so we have an act now that tells that we have to reach net zero by 2050, but we cannot wait until 2049 to do all the effort. In fact, there are some preliminary plans to reach something at 2035, but unfortunately we're not in track to reach that again. So it's because the flow of cash and funds are still in disconnection and disharmony with our climate commitments. So we have our domestic, and the international is the Paris Agreement. We have signed, we are signatories of the Paris Agreement. We are signatories of the UN framework of Convention on Climate Change. And so our bill tries to solve these issues. And as a senator, I can move this type of bill in the Senate, but I cannot move money bills. So I cannot work on the taxation. I cannot assign funds to a particular program, but we can work on the administration and assigning, for example, new responsibilities or duties to the members of boards in the financial sector. Yeah, so in a nutshell is that.
Thank you so much for providing that really great overview for this bill. It's really exciting to hear from that. And I know a lot of folks in the audience are also interested to hear about another bill in the session. It's Bill S5. So I wanted to ask Senator Kutcher, this is the act to amend the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, Sipa, and this would be the first major update to the act in more than 20 years. I know both you and Senator Galvez are on the committee who are studying this bill. Could you just tell us a little bit about this bill, what it aims to do, and why you're sponsoring it?
Oh, certainly. You're right. It is the first amendment to Sipa since 1999. That's a long time ago. And the government tells us it's not the last of the amendments to Sipa. So and its focus is rather narrow. It's on a new approach to the plan of chemicals management for Canada. So that it tends to be quite highly technical, but it also brings what I consider some really key new concepts to environmental legislation for Canada. One, it brings in the concept of environmental justice through the right to a healthier environment. That's really important. It addresses the needs of vulnerable people. It brings forward the idea of intergenerational equity. And it brings in the principle of non-regression. So once we have gone to a certain level, we can't go backwards and say, oh no, we didn't really mean it. We're going to go back to what we did before, which I think are really, really important principles to build on for the future. The other thing that it does, it brings in some additional more wider definitions of toxicity, and looks at carcinogenesis, mutagenesis, and reproductive toxicity, which is fantastic. And it particularly mentions an area that I as a physician, am very interested in, the issue of endocrine disruptors. And it allows us to look for cumulative exposure, not just single exposure. So it brings all sorts of relatively new constructs into this concept of also improving chemical management. And the bill has been before committee. It's at this time. It has looked at multiple amendments. Some of the amendments that I personally am really grateful for, and then Senator Galvez has played a role in many of these, is the issue of animal testing. You know, I may be the only person on the committee who, through my career, have had experience with the animal testing and on the medical side, and this bill has actually really made major changes to how animals shouldn't be used in the toxicity testing of substances. So I'm pleased to see that moving ahead. So is this bill perfect? No bill is perfect, but boy, I think it makes a major step forward.
Thank you for providing also some of the movement in the committee as well. I would also like to point out that it's S5, meaning that this bill is introduced from the Senate, and the public isn't really used to seeing bills starting from the upper chamber. So just could you provide us, what does that mean in terms of having a bill introduced from the Senate versus the House of Commons?
Well, thanks. That's a really interesting, it's a very complicated question, but I think we're starting to see more bills being introduced in the Senate. I don't know the rationale, the reason for that. You'd have to ask the government for that. But what it certainly does, it allows us to look at legislation. We're used to sober second thought. we're doing a little bit of first thought on this, and of course the bill will have to go back to the House, and if the House changes, it may have to come back to the Senate. So it's part of an evolving process. I think Senator Mitchell is probably better being he has the experience and the history of being the government representative in the Senate, or in the office of the government representative in the Senate. So I think it's also a reflection of how the Senate is evolving and developing its role in as a Canadian parliamentary institution. So lots of things are changing now, and then this is one of them.
Awesome, thank you so much. And Senator Galvez, on your bill is a lot of public don't know that senators can actually bring forward legislation. So how do Senate public bills work compared to a private member's bills process in the House of Commons? If you could comment on that.
Well, the process is the same for all bills. All bills at the end have the same royal assent and they have the same value. However, of course, the government has a lot more tools and operational means to carry bigger consultations and move, for example, money bill taxation that senators we don't have. But at the end, the bills have to be studied in both chambers. It's true that they are studied with different lenses. Yes, as Mary pointed out, the regional, the minorities, and the investigation are lenses that we look with the legislation. I also would like to point out that since the independents are there, we have now some standards that we have brought into the picture, like for example, review of the legislation. And in that sense, I just want to mention that, and I think Senator Kutcher is going to understand this, is that we all know, for example, in the case with S5, is that science is always ahead. Science, it's always at the age of the knowledge. And then after it comes technology. Technology is inspired by science, and then they put in practice, in operation, some scientific knowledge. And then it comes then after the regulations, which move faster than policies and bills. Because, for example, we put in a bill some principles, some big principles, and then regulations come and they operate those, and they can absorb some of the changes that is going. But that's why it's so important that we have a cycle of reviewing legislation that is shorter than the 20 years. Because, for example, in the specific case of S5, is that it's true we are talking about animal testing, and we want to reduce and refine and, try to get rid of as much as we can. I have myself done tests in Daphnia and fish, little fish, and for endocrine disruptors and for toxicity. But now I know, for example, from science that genomics has evolved so much, and that so now we can test so many things at DNA level, and that maybe, hopefully, faster, we will not need to have this animal testing because we are having many more tools to do that. And in that sense, I think that we need to, as a legislators, we need to see where the progress is going in order to be attuned and be in parallel with the progress, and not wait 20 years. And I really hope that we are going to review this, but Mary mentioned, the Impact Assessment Act, and that was the same situation. We had something that was not reviewed since the 80s. And so there is a lot of work to do. And we need the time to look at these old bills and modernize them the way it really needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And you've mentioned, the way that the Senate is evolving as well, into the way you're looking at different issues. So I wanted to ask this question to both you and Senator Kutcher. Since you've been a senator, have you seen a change in the way that stakeholders and the public want to engage with the senators and Senate committees on their priorities?
Well, That's a difficult question for me to answer because I'm still rather a junior senator. I was appointed in 2018, and then we've had COVID. So it's been a very, Senator Galvez much more than I have. And Senator Mitchell is the person that really should answer this question too. But I can say particularly our experience, I'm sure Senator Galvez is exactly the same, is on Bill S5. We've had tremendous input from people, from civil society, NGOs, industry, interested citizens, Indigenous groups. I mean, you name the group or person and they've had input. And that input comes to our email, it comes to our telephones, it comes to being stopped on the street. So I think this is great. we want all that input.
I just want to add that to be in this field of pollution and climate change for the last 35 years, I can tell you that when I was starting in this field, there was very little number of people and groups that were interested in this. And I really thought that it was because Canada is so huge that pollution get diluted and nobody sees that. And so therefore, you know, what we don't see, we don't care. So it was like that. But since the last, I would say 10 years, it's unbelievable the number of groups and associations and everybody, you know, doctors for the environment, engineers for the environment, veterans for the environment, mothers for the environment, youth for the environment. And so I think everybody is waking up at this, and they all want to push us legislators to go into a faster pace, again, to reach this low carbon economy, because we are seeing now the impacts of pollution. We have this very big patch of plastic floating in the Pacific, and we know that we are exporting plastic to developing nations. And so we know that the island nations being submerged with the increase in water level. And so, you know, we can't deny it anymore. And so we just have to accelerate the pace of this transformation.
Thank you. And following on that question of considering stakeholders, we know that MPs in the House Commons have a duty to, you know, advocate for the interests of their constituents. So how do senators evaluate the conflict of interests of various stakeholders involved in legislation, such as industry, environmental experts as well? And we know Senate has been viewed a bit more pro-industry than the lower chamber. And so I just want to ask you, Senator Galvez, do you agree with that personally? And why do you think that is or isn't the case?
As my colleagues have said, the Senate is changing, is becoming more independent, and we are pushing for equity, for more having to hear more voices. While I was chair of the Energy, Environment and Natural Resources Committee, I made a point that we needed to have every stakeholder at you know, a distribution of them, and because it was very skewed. At the beginning, when I first arrived, you were right, you know, there was like 70% was industry, and only, you know, the 30% was everybody was packed into there. And so we have a skewed vision of what the situation is. But now I think that we all have other interests. You know, Senator Kutcher is health. He cares for health, so he will push for having some issues or regarding to that. I care a lot about energy and how energy is provided, and the pollution in the atmosphere. So we will push to hear from academics, for example, that were not there, or think tanks, or vulnerable populations that are affected more because of some kind of local pollution. And of course, the rights of indigenous people and the relationship between the energy and the indigenous people is so overlapping that this is so important that we hear everybody there. And so we can really solve some of these problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you talk about, you know, consider Indigenous people as well in those issues. We actually have an audience question for Senator Coyle, if I could invite you on camera. We want to just ask you how senators will work towards protecting Indigenous land sovereignty and initiatives to maintain biodiversity. And we know that you're on the Senate Standing Committee for Aboriginal Peoples. So how are these priorities being addressed by this committee as well?
Thank you so much, Coco. Yes, just very, very briefly. I think it's important for everybody to know that out of the current 88 senators, there are 17 vacancies, but there are 88 senators. 9 of them are Indigenous. You know, we've never had this level of Indigenous participation in the Senate, and it's very important to know, because anything we do has to be Indigenous led. I am on the Aboriginal Peoples Committee, and we have 5 Indigenous senators on that committee. And in our Senators for Climate Solutions group, we have 3 Indigenous senators, and 2 of them are part of our steering group. So there's a big influence there. Let me just give you a little example. Of course, Aboriginal Peoples Committee, like all committees in the Senate, our primary business is to review government legislation, right? And review government legislation that is specifically to do with Aboriginal people in Canada, but also sometimes look at legislation that can have an impact on Indigenous people. So right now, our Aboriginal Peoples Committee is looking at self-government, okay? This Indian Act, it's antiquated, it's got to go, it's very problematic. Today, just one little bill that we're looking at is looking at self-government issues for the Anishinaabe Nation, for the Seychelles Nation, and for the Yukon First Nations. So there's quite a geographic variety there. So questions around the transference of authority for governance over lands, et cetera, to Indigenous people is what's at the heart of this. We also recently completed a study on environmental health issues related to safe drinking water in First Nations communities, which of course we know is a huge problem here in Canada. So just give you those examples. We do the studies and we look at legislation. That's how our committee works. And of course, first and foremost, we have these 9 Indigenous senators who can lead the charge and help guide the whole of the Senate on issues related to environmental health.
Thank you for that. And on similar topic as Senator Galvez, several of your colleagues identified how gaps in the Sipa Act impact Indigenous people and land. So what work do you think needs to be done on this front if or when the bill is passed by the Senate and returned to the House of Commons for reconsideration?
My colleague, Senator Mary McCallum, she's an unaffiliated senator, have proposed several amendments regarding that, particularly including a prior and informed concern, focusing on that, putting priority on this one that was passed. Hopefully this is an amendment that will remain and it won't be taken out. But we have a lot of work to do still. And we have to hear all groups. There are so many nations and they also have diversity in their opinions. But in general, there is a history of that they will talk, that they will explain about colonialization and then environmental racism and then oppression and then difficult relationship with the authority, especially with the police. And we all have read the Wet'suwet'en story and the pipelines. So I think that we have to solve these issues. We have to, reconciliation needs to be real, not just in words, but it needs to be real. And I think that when Mary was talking about having citizen assemblies, we will have to give visibility and here listening to Indigenous people. And as my work as in parliamentarian diplomacy with Parliamericas, I have to deal a lot with issues of Indigenous people of the Americas. And so I'm very much informed of what's going on and some things that are better advanced in other jurisdictions with respect to this recognition. And so we have to keep the discussion open, but not only the discussion, but also the actions. So like we can measure progress. To me, it's very important that we measure progress because promises are, so easy to say, but we have to find indicators, parameters that measures we were here today and now we are here. So we see the progress that is done, and hopefully we'll go in that direction.
Thank you so much. And I know that you folks have to head off to chamber. So I want to just give a big thank you to all three of you, Senators Coyle, Kutcher, and Galvez, for your time and sharing your insights with us. Thank you for speaking on this panel, and we really hope to have more conversations like this one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Now you're going to get the wisdom from the guy who really is the wise one.
Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. Take care. Thank you, Coco. Bye-bye.
So I want to now invite Mr. Grant Mitchell to, if you can turn on your camera, sir.
I'm trying to do that.
No problem.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, but not see you yet.
Okay, I got it. Yes,
Perfect.
I couldn't do that. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, we know that you have had a really critical role as the Liberal government's liaison in the Senate, and just love to pick your brain on many of the things that we talked about earlier as well. So just to start, we know that the new Senate is less partisan than it was under past constructs, with independent and unaffiliated senators making up the majority, and those three of the senators who are with us. So from your perspective, how does the Senate's relative non-partisanship compared to the House impacts ability to get things done? And is partisanship any less constrained to progress on environmental and other issues that have been treated as wedge issues in the House?
Thanks very much, Chair. And I want to thank GreenPAC for organizing this, for including me, and certainly my colleagues for including me in this as well. And it's a real treat. I'm retired but not disengaged, and it's a treat to be back working with at least three senators as I am today. In answer to your question about the improvement or impact, one, it is true that the less partisan nature of the Senate post-reform, post-2015, has had a positive impact on the capacity of the Senate to be effective in ways that historically perhaps it hasn't. I want to be careful to say that the Senate has always had very good people and has always done very good work. But to your point, which in your question, constraint. So three things, in three ways, I think it's been concretely opened up. One, there is a greater possibility for collaboration than there was before. There has been collaboration historically through committee work and other kinds of work, but there was always the constraint of partisan political party lines. The very fact that Senators Coyle and Kutcher have organized the group that they have, that is at the base of this panel, is indication of a much broader collaboration. A recent major study headed up by Senator Peter Harder, for example, on economics involved a broader, and it actually came up, and I'm sure this group will too as well, but with specific recommendations that are now beginning to permeate public policy discussion more broadly. And I think I would add to that to say that because people aren't in a partisan capacity more and more, fewer and fewer, at least in the Senate, are in a partisan legacy kind of caucus, there is a different kind of credibility. There isn't that lingering, latent question about, well, maybe they're doing this because they've been directed to do this by their national politically elected caucus or the leader of their national party. And I think that enhances the ability for it to be, for the Senate to be more effective.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Mitchell, we know that also senators are free from constraints of short-term electoral cycles, unlike the MPs. So does this have any genuine impact also on the Senate's Senate's capacity to affect the environmental agenda?
Historically, the Senate has never been encumbered by, if I can put it that way, by the electoral cycle. So to some extent, that hasn't changed. However, those advantages, among many others, but the three that I just mentioned, I think really have built upon that advantage. There is a huge advantage to be able to take an issue that might not have a specific political application, say in a member of parliament's constituency, and so might be less interesting for a member of parliament to pick up and do something with. That doesn't exist, of course, for a senator. And many issues take years to develop, I think, and therefore do benefit from not being interrupted by a one term in the House of Commons, or 2 or even 3. And you see that senators are able to develop expertise. They bring much expertise, but they can develop an expertise. They can develop a national and even international recognition and credibility and admiration that allows them to be very, very effective. So I wouldn't say that it's new that the election cycle is an advantage, or the lack of having to be constrained by an election cycle. I would say that it is, in as much as it still exists, it exists in an environment where it is more, it can be built upon more effectively by less constrained senators.
Gotcha. And we are seeing more public Canadians, trying to engage with senators on issues. And last June, we saw, the urge to passage of Bill C-12 on the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. And so I'm just wondering, what advice would you give for environmental groups and members of the public who are looking for legislators to champion strong environmental policy?
One of the advantages, and maybe I didn't cover this adequately in my first answer, of the reforms is that senators are much more inclined to amend and to move their own legislation. And that wasn't necessarily at all the case before, in part because moving your own legislation didn't amount to much because you couldn't get it through because governments didn't really want to consider that. They don't need the competition, and they've got lots of other things on their agenda. And amendments, well, if you were in the government caucus, you weren't going to move an amendment. You would be constrained from doing that very likely, most cases. And if you're in the opposition caucus, you wouldn't have enough majority, generally speaking, to get an amendment passed. So that means it is worthwhile to talk to senators because amendments can be made and legislation can be passed. And I had a piece of legislation passed for Call Before You Dig, and it's been affected, got through, and is now being implemented through regulation on the other side. That wouldn't have happened before. But in the 4 years almost that I was in the new regime, as it were, the reform regime, it was clear that the Senate amended significantly 35 of 88 or 86 pieces of legislation. So that means, and this is very key, part of the success of that process is that you have a government that is actually willing to accept that. And that could change, but even if it were to change, the Senate, constructed as it is now, will have leverage because they can delay legislation, and that puts pressure on governments to respond to amendments.
That's really great to know, I think, for a lot of groups. And so do you have any recommendations on strategies to engage with senators or Senate groups and committees? Yes,
I do. And they've been covered largely, but I've been in politics. I had been in politics a long time. And often people say, well, I'm going to write to my MP or I'm going to write to my MLA or my senator. I say, that's great, but they probably get a variation on that particular email or letter in the old days. That's how old I am. Thousands and thousands. If it's more difficult probably to get to speak to an MP in some senses, but senators aren't inundated by that. I would say phone and ask to meet, ask to speak. They live in your region. They come home every weekend, even more now they're home. Ask to speak to them. That would be a first thing, because that's very powerful. And I, as a longtime person in this environment, I can tell you that it's very powerful to speak with people. And it's perhaps the only way you actually build a consensus and understand the other side. So that's important. And also work with senators, get to know them. Senators are interested in your area, this group, and come up with ideas and capture their imagination for, well, maybe it's time to do a specific study. Maybe it's been done, but by this group on, or a component of this group on carbon capture and storage as a way to get us at least in an interim step to 2050, or on small nuclear, and then they have resources. They can do a special study, as I alluded to Senator Harder's, or they can get a committee to do a study. And the thing about that is those committees, those kinds of studies are able to attract very, very informative, high quality, high prestige, and high credibility witnesses. So you can get your witnesses, people who are with your group, to appear, and that can be very powerful.
That's awesome. Actually, one of the audience questions we had was, can you tell us how the public helps senators advance their work? So you've already covered that in the last answer. And could you actually share, this is another question from the audience, some of the unique procedural challenges that senators face that folks from the environmental community may not actually be aware of?
It's a very intricate process. Legislatures generally, in the Senate, I would say in particular. People think that if there's a majority behind something, it can get done in the Senate. And eventually it usually does. But the Senate can be delayed by as few as 2 people. Every time we have a vote in the Senate, say a vote to adjourn or a request to have a vote on a bill, it only takes 2 people to stand up and say, we want to have that vote recorded and we're going to have an hour bell. So an hour later, they get defeated. And so it looks like you could vote on Bill S5, but all of a sudden, just the same 2 people can stand up and move a subsequent motion and get another hour bell. So you can delay that forever. That's a problem. And the other thing, the other constraint that sometimes the public or people that I dealt with don't fully understand is, yes, the Senate can defeat a bill, but it is extremely dangerous, problematic for an unelected body to defeat a bill that has been passed by an elected body. And so it would have to be done in very rare cases with very, very high stakes and with great consideration of what that does to the credibility of the democratic process. Having said that, in 1993, across party lines, senators defeated the government's bill to diminish choice for women. And that was quite obviously very significant and very rare. And interestingly, just for the wonks out there, it was defeated on a tie vote. It came down to a tie vote. And so a tie vote means you go back to the status quo. And at that time, we didn't have legislation on abortion, and we don't. So the Senate did that, but you have to be, so those are 2 kinds of constraints. There's probably, there are many more, of course. One was alluded to, Senate committees' priorities to review government legislation. So if you're working on something else and a government legislation comes up, they're going to be taken off to do that. And I also, and the idea of moving amendments, even if you get them passed, they can be thrown, they could be considered, of course, by the House and sent back. And then you're confronted with this idea of how hard do you go against an elected House. And so that's a constraint again.
Thank you for breaking that down for us. And unfortunately, arriving at time, I do have one more question. I think this is more for young folks in the crowd and myself. I've been told that you first got involved in politics as an intern with the parliamentary internship program. So I'm just curious how that has shaped your career, and if you have any advice for young political interns like myself.
Yes, thank you. I'm very excited about that. I was a parliamentary intern in 1974, 75, and it's a program, 10 graduates a year are hired by the House of Commons, and they work for half a year on each side of the House. Remarkable experience. It fueled my interest in politics. Ultimately, I wasn't thinking about running at that time by any means, but at some point it struck me that if people like me don't do this, who does? We have an obligation, we have a duty to this process. And I realized that I wasn't going to be better than the MPs I'd worked with or observed, but I thought, well, maybe I can just do a good deal of what they're doing. I will say that it's extremely important that these programs and many other things are undertaken to fight back against the cynicism and the erosion of credibility that people feel for their institutions and their politicians very quickly. Somebody once said to me, the parliamentary system is the most successful system of government on the face of the earth. And it is. It's lasted for literally hundreds of years. There's nothing like it. And it lasts because it works, and it responds to and accommodates the human condition and the need to debate and the need to have somebody yelling for you somewhere on your behalf because you care. And that's why question period is a very effective part of it, no matter how cynical people are about question period. So I encourage people, and I welcome people like you and GreenPAC for their effort to bring people like you into this process to get to understand it and feel its importance and its significance and its goodness. And then maybe one day you'll be the Prime Minister of Canada, Coco.
That's the dream. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Mitchell, for joining us, and thank you for the audience for joining this session. Just want to thank everyone on behalf of GreenPAC. I want to remind folks that the event recording will be shared, and we'll appreciate it if you could take 3 minutes to provide some feedback on the event. So thank you so much. Merci, and see you all soon.
Bye.